Welcome to Between the Lines, a podcast hosted by former world number one Laura Massaro and performance coach Ahad Raza.
We break down what's really happening in high-level squash across the technical, tactical, physical and mental realms and help you translate it into action.
You will hear match analysis, guided insights, coaching demonstrations, and conversations with some of the best minds in sport.
But this isn't just about the theory. It's about growing a community of curious players and coaches dedicated to unlocking their potential together.
So if you're ready to train smarter, think deeper, and play better, join us Between the Lines.
Hi everyone and welcome to Between the Lines. We have DP on the call today, and in fact have just wrapped up the call with him, and really interesting chat. He talked a lot about his technical coaching, what underpins technique and his beliefs when he is coaching players of all levels. We also touched upon what he believes makes a top player and the attributes they need to have. And he was also quite keen to reference the current controversy with Asal. So that was really interesting to get his take on that. While throughout the podcast, he poked fun at me the whole way. So I'm sure that will be enjoyable for everybody listening. One of the best coaches in the world, in my opinion, and certainly part of the conversation, even if you don't agree. I hope you really enjoy this listen.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Between the Lines. Today we have the infamous David Pearson joining us. And David was Laura's coach, Nick Matthews' coach, many other legendary players' coaches. This is going to be a fun conversation. You're probably going to hear David poking some fun at Laura along the way, which is going to make it even more enjoyable. And David, David, we're pleased to have you. Laura, any first words about David?
Yeah, can I get in first?
Yeah, no. Get it first.
No, I'm really, and I know this is a little out of your comfort zone, but you'll settle in. Few poking fun at me, and you'll be straight in, I'm sure. But thanks for coming on. I know you're going to have some wise words of wisdom to pass on to everybody.
Absolutely. Well, David, we'll get into it. I know Laura's told me a little bit about you, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this one. You know, there's so many things that players can develop in their game, you know, whether it's swing technique, movement, whatever. But do you have some form of a pyramid of skill development? Are there certain things that you like to say that this is the crux of squash? These are must-haves, and then you sort of build upon them? Or do you like to really customize it based on every person as they come?
Well, I think the two main ingredients for me, for great squash players, is the first thing is movement. If you see a young kid with unbelievable movement, you know you're onto a winner in many ways. And secondly, technique for me is the most important thing. I always feel if you can teach reasonable technique, that basically then dictates the tactics. So you can put the ball where you want it to go. Whereas I find a lot of coaches, just generalizing, they do all these different routines, but technically what happens when the guys maybe play a game, they can't put the ball in the right place. So really then, for me, tactics goes out the window. You've got to be able to put the ball in the right place, cover the right shot to be able to hit the right tactic. So I think that comes from technique. I know I'm a bit paranoid about technique, but that's my simple view.
Yes.
So I have a very simple way of looking at the game, really, in many ways. Simply, if you're a good mover, good volleyer, reasonable technique, then you can access the tactics, and then you can become mentally tougher.
I love that.
I always
that makes sense.
Yeah, I obviously have got the trouble for me with this podcast is trying to ask you questions that I already know the answer to, but nobody else will. But I'm interested as well on the back of that answer to sort of think, okay, so if how is that in comparison to kind of the past? Do you think technique is more or less important now than it has been? And how do you rate the technique in the top players now in comparison to back in the day? Is it better, worse, or same?
I'm going to lead myself into trouble here. I think back in the day, if you want to use that for an expression, I think players were technically more proficient than today. I think there was because the tin was higher, you had a little bit more time to play the game. So you had more time to access getting the ball tight, etc. Whereas these days, everything's so fast that people just tend to, what I see is they just hit the ball and move and don't really get the ball that tight down the walls. So, and I think that's why in this day and age, there's quite a lot of interference in the game because the ball isn't that tight. So it opens options for people who maybe want to, play in a certain type of way. So I think technically the game has gone, in my opinion, has gone backwards from what it was from yesteryear. But that might be because there's not as much time these days.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but arguably, you would think that with less time, the technique needed to be even better because of that, because you rush.
Well, yeah, I think you're right. So if you go back a little bit, say Nick Matthews and James Willstrop, they used to get the ball so tight down the walls, which as you watch today, I don't really see that as much, if that makes sense. It's I think it's maybe a modern thing. Technique isn't worked on as much as it should have been or should be. So I think it's gone out the window a little bit. If you look at golf or sports like that, they're very technically based. Cricket, different sports, and I think squash has taken a bit of a backward move in that sense. If that makes sense again.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. No, I was wondering, like, do you feel that, as the game gets faster and quicker and, the athletes are becoming more powerful and the technology is getting lighter and easier to maneuver, do you feel that a variety of techniques, so multiple swings, being able to do things with a shorter swing, all that sort of stuff?
Oh, no, definitely. I think, if you look at all the guys in top 10 in the world or the girls in the top 10 of the world, a lot of them really have different techniques.
Yes.
You've got Paul Collu, who plays more with the old Aussie technique through Robert Owen. Yeah. Ali Farag is just a relaxed, natural player. Diego Elias is just a lovely, smooth player. I know Jonathan Power's done a lot of work over the years with Diego. So, I think there are a whole bunch of different techniques that can be used. I think the key to technique, because so many coaches have so many ideas, is if it works, the technique must be pretty good.
Right.
So you might have, like when Laura played, there was very much an English technique, and it worked, but that might not work for some other players. Yeah. So I think in the top 10 now, you see all these different techniques, but they're working. So technique can be many different things as long as it works.
Yeah. So when you talk about techniques and technical work maybe being less than maybe it was back in the day, as we call it, you're really talking about lower down the rankings a little bit, that kind of depth of
that depth of
people being very solid in their technique.
Yeah, I think so. I think, once you start to maneuver out the top 20 or so, the technique isn't to me anyway, isn't all that great, to be honest. But as I say, I mean, you know me, Laura, you like with your technique, Nick Matthew, Jenny, Peter Nicol, all these players were heavily based technical players. From my background, really, I think.
Well, I think that was one of the things that we wanted to touch upon. You've already mentioned, like, we wanted to talk about the importance of technique, but I think just for people listening who won't have a clue, I grew up with you as England national coach, and we spent hours and hours on what was the old Quintic.
Yeah.
Basically, now you can get it on an app in your phone, but it's a slow motion kind of like frame by frame breakdown of your swing. And I think that players would be absolutely flabbergasted, really, to be able to see their swing broken down on, what it's doing. I don't think a lot of players know what their technique is doing, and that's part of the problem. But that's obviously disappeared a lot, hasn't it? And what sort of importance do you go back to that for bringing through all the successful players?
Well, I mean, a good example is probably Nick Matthews, the best example. When he was 18 years of age, his swing was horrendous. And he had no chance of becoming a top 10 player in the world. But we spent, and it took 5 years with the Quintic system you just mentioned, and we went through every little bit of it, if that makes sense.
Wow.
And what came out was Nick Matthews' swing as we know today. I wouldn't say it's perfect, and it was a little bit exaggerated because we had to do so much manual work that everything got slightly exaggerated. But what it did give him at the end of the day for Nick Matthew was to become world number one. He would have been always quite a good player because he had that guts and determination. But without the Quintic and the technique, he would have never been one of the greatest English player probably that's existed, really. And that was a 5-year process, Laura, and and in fact I've just done a little bit at Brunswick with the kids. Alistair, he managed to get the app. We've just downloaded it, and we're starting that process off again. And Laura yourself, you spent a lot of work on that type of stuff, didn't you?
Yeah.
The little minuscule things.
Certainly at my junior career, like a lot of that it was fantastic because we had a big, your old-fashioned plasma screen on wheels on the glass court in Manchester, just to describe it for people. We had Stafford Murray, our analyst who kind of went off to do big things with England rugby and New Zealand cricket, and
well, he's now English cricket. He's doing head of analysis for English cricket.
Yeah, and all of these sports are still having this Quintic work done. All right, it's modified a bit, it's on the phone, but he was there replaying it. Right, hit 10 shots, DP would feed, let's go and have a look at that. 2 hours, you maybe might have hit 50 balls if you were lucky, and you'd go back and you'd have a look and you'd be like, and then you'd adapt something tiny and look again. And it was that in-depth analysis. And so for people listening as well, this is obviously very high-end stuff, but the amount of players that I coach now that even just, kind of Div 4, Div 5 players that you go on, and I'm just going to set my video up out the back of the court, and they go, oh my God, I don't even look like I'm making squash shapes.
Yeah.
And you're like... So, you have to see yourself on camera, guys. Like, you have to. And then the whole next level of that is like, slow it down. Even just on your,
look at every
iPhone, you can do that.
Little part of the swing. One little part of the swing can affect the next part of the swing, and so on. That type of knock-on effect.
But if you're doing that at England cricket level, England rugby, we see it all the time in golf. I know it's a static ball, static person, but tennis are doing it. NFL, NBA, like every sport where there is big money, particularly, it's like, where can we find 1%? And I do think I absolutely agree, and I'm totally biased or just brainwashed by you over the years, that technique massively underpins everything. And you're right, like while I was, and probably now even teach because I understand it the most and it worked for me, basically what you taught me, there's other techniques out there which maybe we might touch upon in a little while, but ultimately, if you're creating a champion and they can put the ball, I'd be interested to see your take on this, but Danny always said to me that you're a how coach and not a what coach. Okay. Well, what coach would be like, what am I going to do with the ball? Where am I going to put the ball? And you're like, yeah, but how are you going to put it there?
Well, so, I remember being at without mentioning names here, because you don't want to get personal, but I remember being in Virginia once, going back in time, and I was sitting next to a coach. And he was saying, they've got to play that shot from that area tactically, very astute coach. And I said to him, you're totally right. But I said, if they haven't got the technique to be able to do that, it's not going to go where you want them to put the ball. So to me, technique is the most vital thing that you can have, combined with movement. And I don't think there's enough emphasis put on personally.
Yeah, and when you think about technique, DP, do you like? There are different thoughts, different literature maybe that says if you get too much of the minutia, sometimes it breaks down you're too cognitive, and then you break down. Versus, and I think there's almost a sequence of when to break things down into the minutia, and then maybe using certain cues when the technique has been ingrained slightly to just remind yourself. Did you have a bit of a process when it came to how you stack those skills?
Yeah, I don't know, actually. You know what? I've always just coached as I've coached. And the important thing for me is if you've got to get the mix right, like with the fun, the movement, and you don't want to bore people to death, do you? You want to keep them interested.
Yeah.
But I know when we did all that stuff, it was very much all the players we did it with were very, very interested. And for some reason, they didn't find it particularly boring.
Mm.
And I think the other thing is, if you have a good technique and you have good movement, the coach then can reach its zenith by getting into someone's head.
Mm.
So if technique is good and your movement's good, you then can get into the head, which is at the end of the day is the key to being successful in many ways. How to make someone mentally tough, or what that expression might mean. So
do you know what's really interesting though? Like when you say about that, why we didn't find it boring, I think a lot of it was the way that you made it sound.
Yeah,
I think it was the intrigue and the excitement and I remember our very first session when I was outside of that, when you were outside of the England setup, and I was kind of transitioning maybe between Phil Whitlock and yourself, and we jumped on court at the US Open. Do you remember?
Yeah, I can remember at Drexel.
At Drexel, yeah. And I remember coming off that court being excited because it was like you'd said to me, we can go there. And obviously it was peak time because I'd just lost to Raneem, and Danny will say back, you might be better off telling the story that you looked at him as if like with a look that went, get used to that result if you don't change anything.
Yeah.
But you made it sound like, you knew what was missing from my game and you could help. And any athlete who sees that is going to be excited.
What happened there, Laura, was what I was able to do, maybe through my personality, because I'm a little bit weird, aren't I, really, was I was opening a window for you that you didn't really probably thought might exist. And then the window for a long, so everything just started to open up and it became interesting. Before, we talk about the grip, people go, why would 1 centimeter make a difference? Well, it does. If you open the window and make it interesting for someone. And I was always my personality is, I'm always through the sense of humor. So I'd always make the sessions fun through sense of humor. So people didn't get bored, learn how to laugh at yourself. Because at one stage, Laura, with you, it was very difficult for you to laugh at yourself, wasn't it, really? Until you got on court with me. And then
I was serious and no nonsense and hard working.
Without, now this is going to hurt you. Like my wife. Remember what my wife used to call you, Laura?
Apart from Lily?
Apart from Lily, she had another word. We took a picture of it in New York once when you were at the Touring Champions out of shop. Pie face.
Oh, yeah.
So basically, you never used to smile like you are now.
That was Paul Carter, that one. Was that Joe as well?
Yeah, that was Joe. No, it was Joe. And about the end of your career, you didn't have such a pie face. So you started to be able to. You started to be able to laugh at yourself.
You're right. You're definitely right. And the thing was, I always felt like you always said that the player makes the coach look good. And, you'll have had hundreds of stories, won't you, over the years of players that haven't made the coach look good or haven't made you look good. And that's the thing, isn't it? When you get a player who's interested and hardworking and prepared to take the blinkers off, then as a coach, I guess you must feel like you can run with that a little bit. Well, it makes it more interesting for the coach then, because he feels he's making some sort of headway, if that makes sense. Yeah. But I always think the thing is that the main thing about coaching, to me, is in a way you've got to be a sports psychologist, because I think lots of people can coach squash but can they get into people's head? So I think a good coach is somebody who can get into someone's head and make them believe in what they want to believe in. I always remember, Laura, I don't know if you've done it, but I remember Peter Nicol going back years ago. I always remember when he made a comment, said, well, I always knew I was going to be number one in the world. And I was thinking, how did you know that at 11 years of age? Come on. But basically, he did believe in it because the people who worked with him over the years managed to get into his head to help him to reach that goal. So it's never pie in the sky where you go, I'm going to be world number one. He actually believed it and he achieved it. Nick Matthew did. You did, Laura. You're all the same, tarred with the same brush.
Yeah. And,
Very
it's
strange
interesting.
Individuals.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting sometimes even just talking about the way things were 20 or 30 years ago compared to now, where everything is written out in a formal plan. You have
Yeah.
formal goals, long-term goals, medium-term goals, short-term goals, technical goals, tactical goals, et cetera, et cetera. How were you more of a feel-based coach where you
Yeah,
didn't
very
get
much a
into a ton
feeling.
of those?
Very much a feeling, but nobody could ever get me to write down a session. So, Laura would turn up some days and we're like, what are we going to do today? Oh, yeah, I know. And then as soon as the ball started being hit, bang, oh, we're going to do that today. So,
Right.
yeah, my background, and I've always been a coach that's just felt things along the way. I've not been a planner. And I think there's too much of that goes on. I'm not saying you don't have to plan, but there's so much planning goes on that you become the clipboard coach. Do that routine, boom, boom, boom. And then that becomes too much.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, sorry, go ahead, finish your thought.
And I think there's a lot of that goes on now. I mean, I watch, it's interesting going to these American tournaments, and the one thing I notice, they're all extremely fit. They hit the ball pretty hard. They're very competitive, but technically they are so far behind. Not everybody, obviously, but just as a general comment. So what happens is tactically, when they come across maybe like an Egyptian, for instance, who might play 4 trickle bows in a row or hold the ball or whatever they do, they just can't read the game. And I think that's the thing. When it comes to playing squash, they're not that great. What to do with the ball,
right? And in your mind, just on this, I'd love for you to elaborate on that a bit. And on this concept of technique, like in your mind, what is the ultimate technique? If you were to take a player or components of different players, what is that for you?
See, I remember on a national squad once, many years ago in England, we used to get a lot of backlash from other coaches. And when I would stand up there and say, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, they looked at you as though this is when I have a fight with you. So what we decided to do was get a video and put 10 top players in the world on the video. And we'd say to them, right, now we're going to talk about the grip, for instance. And, someone, said, well, look at all those 10 players there, all the best players in the world, male and female. What's their grip like? That's what we talk about. Everyone had more or less the same grip within reason. The other big thing is the spacing just on the forehand rather than being too tight in.
Yes.
So cutting a long story short, I think there's seven or eight things in a swing that every player has, no matter what style of technique they might have, if that makes sense.
That does. And actually, for people listening, I'm sure people would love to know what those 7 or 8 things are. So you said there's some space.
Basically, you've got the grip you've got to work on. Like when you're starting off, spacing on the forehand here, making sure at the top of the swing, the wrist isn't too cocked.
Yeah.
It's more of it, for me anyway, it's more in a neutral position rather than it being here or too cocked here. So that position at the top of the swing, I think at impact, you're looking to extend your elbow, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Yeah, and making sure your follow through is a little bit like the Statue of Liberty, all in rhythm, obviously. So you just get this simple rhythm going through your stroke. And then you bring in the movements, I'm very much into transfer of weight, a bit like a baseball pitcher taking his weight to throw the baseball. So I'm not into taking little steps, getting to the ball, keeping still and hitting the ball. I'm more into lunging a little bit to get a nice flow in and a flow back. So you're making the game very easy physically for your opponent. For you, I mean, not your opponent, for yourself. I got that one wrong. For yourself. And I always remember Nick Matthew played Greg Gautier in the final of the World Championships. And Nick won 3-2. Greg came off. This was in Manchester, in England. And he could hardly stand up. He was totally exhausted. He was shouting at the referee and, doing the French thing. And I always remember going around the back of the corner to speak to Nick after he'd won. And it was like talking to you now.
Wow.
Apart from him sweating.
Sure.
And that was because his movement was so economical. He could have played on for another hour and a half.
Wow. So
that's the philosophy I've always tried to ingrain in the players I've sort of worked with over the years. And Laura, when Laura was before maybe I started coaching a lot, Laura wasn't the quickest, right? And then when she started having coaching, she started to understand what transfer of weight was. And the difference, although Laura was never a sprightly, quick mover because of her height,
yes.
But she learned how to transfer weight, and that made the difference to Laura becoming a top 10 player rather than becoming world number one. So it helped Laura a lot, I think. And I always remember Laura once saying to me, said, when I'm moving well, I feel my technique is just good as well. If I'm not moving well, my technique tends to break down. So it's this flow of movement you're looking for, a bit like a wave, which never crashes, if that makes sense.
I love that. So it's funny. It's interesting that you mentioned the wave, because I use the wave analogy with my students as well.
Yeah.
Thinking about sort of power off the tee, thinking about, controlling yourself as you get to the ball, and then power off the shot.
Yeah.
And so there's this constant wave transfer of energy.
You're like a wave. You can hover for maybe a second and then go again. So when you hover, you don't crash. You always got your weight being able to be transferred, if that makes sense.
This excites me because I use the term hover with my students as well. So this is great.
So, and I think even my stepdaughter, who was, got to number 2 in the world for a good 3 years or so. Wow. Jenny was never a very, which Laura will contest to, was never a strong mover because her leg shape wasn't, as maybe muscly as Nicole David, for instance. But because she'd been taught such smooth movements, the movement, unless she was under horrendous pressure, was always in rhythm. It was only breaking down when maybe Nicole used to play because the pace got too fast.
Right.
But the smoothness of the rhythm can get you to a high level without you having to be such an unbelievable athlete.
Right.
I think as well, like when you think about, and I'm probably biased, but obviously I think you're the world's greatest coach, and I think that the record proves that with Nick. Well, simply, if you're not, in my opinion, the world's best, but you're certainly in the conversation, with the champions you've created, Nick, myself, Peter Nicol, Cassie. You can probably.
Oh yeah, I know. Well, Paul Johnson. I mean, there's so many players.
And
BJ,
I mean, there's just there's so many that even just made top 10 in the world, which is unbelievable. Yeah. And I think if you were teaching any of us now with the game the way it is, I guess what I'm saying is, say you got hold of someone inside the top 10 now, and you were like, okay, I want to make you. I want to make you world champion. Would you be teaching the same stuff?
I'd be teaching the same stuff. And
how would you account for the quicker game? Do you just think that needs to be done a little bit more off the court?
Sorry, say that again, Laura.
Do you think that the stuff that, like that physicality, the longer matches, the speed? So I think I heard Camp say
that's off the court. All that stuff would be maybe done off the court.
Yeah.
But I think the basic process I was talking about before, I wouldn't change anything, to be honest. It might have been done a bit quicker or something, but I wouldn't change the base of what my belief of how squash should be played.
Yeah.
I don't think I'd change a thing. I think it's like anything. You've got to mix the old with the new, and not look at everything through rose-tinted glasses. Yeah. You've got to get what the modern player's doing, because it's obviously very good, and you've got to have it a little bit with the old style, if that makes sense. So you're mixing the two together to try and get a perfect player, I suppose.
Yeah.
Right. And what does. Yeah, is there a player that's come as close to being perfect in your mind? Can you think of a player like that?
Gosh. Shabana. Maybe one of them. He was just someone like Shabana, he never had to train like a lunatic. He was fit, but he wouldn't want to play for more than an hour and 20 minutes, even in a 5-setter. Right. But because he had such rhythm in his swing, such rhythm in his movement, he read the game a little bit earlier than most players out there. He always gave himself time just to be able to do all these things. So, he would he would play for an hour and 10 minutes. He never had to go into what you might call the physical depths of desperation or anything, because he understood the game, basically. And I don't think there's many players at our top end. I think Ali Farag, although he's got a slightly obviously different swing, he understands the game how the game should be played, what the rhythm of movement should be like.
Right.
What about on the women's side?
I'm going about now when it comes to the girls, I think Sherbini is a great example again of somebody who's not the greatest athlete in the world, but she's got an unbelievable, lovely swing, holds the ball. She has a great sense of how to play squash. So I think in the ladies' game, if you want to look at how to play the game of squash, to become a squash player rather than just a squash player, I think Sherbini is probably the best example, and Renee Melwili as well.
And actually, Sherbini, I think, would, for me as well, I think, although you're right, and I would count myself in this category as well, like not the greatest athlete, but sort of maximised what they've had.
What they can have,
I actually do think as well that Sherbini moves like you would teach.
Yeah.
She transfers her weight, and she has that moment. She gets balls back that you wouldn't expect her to get back, because she can extend the leg, because she transfers her weight, because she goes up off the tee rather than kind of going low off the tee. She can then transfer her weight. That wave never crashes. Whereas what you see as you go a bit further down is a bit more squatting on the tee. People approach the ball a bit lower. So you get these athletes that are, in my opinion, so much better than Sherbini or myself, or people who are less athletic naturally, but don't get the balls back that you would expect them to, because they can't extend the leg, they can't throw the leg and extend, like, used to say, I think me and Nick were very similar with like the go-go gadget arms. That you were like, how did you not just because you're tall?
Well, in some ways it looked like you were, Nick and you in particular, looked like you were double jointed. You'd go to a bit further than most people would. If you're maybe around the middle looking for a volley drop or something like that. Well, that's not just for people listening as well. That for me isn't because I just got good at volleying. That comes from the feet. Would you agree? Yeah. From the feet.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So when I've got people, they go, I just want to volley a bit more. All they try and do is volley a bit more.
Yeah.
But you sort of kind of go in as a coach, how can you teach people, how would you teach people to volley more through movement, which is what a lot of people wouldn't, it's like, no, that's not right, because if I volley more, I just extend my arms more and I just push up the tee and I hunt. And I don't think that you would teach volleying like that. You would actually teach movement, and then they would just volley more.
Volley. Well, if you looked at pictures that used to come out a little while ago, say you or Nick, you looked, when you were on maybe going across the middle to do a volley drop, for instance, you looked like an eagle was spreading their wings, if that makes sense. So you just keep going on forever.
Yeah.
Plonk, because the weight was being transferred. You weren't moving your feet just to get to the ball, stand there and play your volley drop or whatever.
Yeah. So can you, I feel like I know what that means because I've been taught it. I'm wondering whether or not, even, what do you think, Ahad, whether people would actually know what transfer of weight on a squash court means?
I think it's probably worth it to spell it out, just so people understand.
I think so basically if a ball, I'm trying to set the scenario up, is out in front of you and you're on the tee, let's not go if you're on the tee, he's been able to, and it's not just transfer, it's carrying of weight as well. So because a lot of people have always had a bit of well, if you lunge too far, you're going to fall over. The secret to the lunge, and the Pakistanis are brilliant at it, or were brilliant at it,
right?
Within the transfer of weight, so you're taking a bigger last stride, was the carrying of that last stride. So when you got to the ball, you didn't fall over. So you could take a nice transfer of weight. It's quite hard to describe, but carry your weight and then maybe play a lob or whatever, and then just recover back to the tee. So it's a transfer and a carry. So the last stride to me is the most important thing, I think. And you described it there. When you're going into the ball, when you get to the ball, is to actually have some time to go into the ball. You're not just going in and just whacking it. It's the timing of the weight coming in. So it's like if I hold off, I'm holding off, bang. Then I'm back to the tee. I'm holding off, bang. back to the
Right.
tee. And it's getting that type of movement within that feel, if that makes sense.
It does.
Describing it well.
I think Jonathan, like I remember the one person that comes to my mind is Jonathan Power in the back left of the court. Whenever he would get there, you would sort of see him like flowing, and then he'd have a slight pause, and then he'd step in with his close stance, and then he'd come through the ball, and then he'd kind of recover with that push out and the swing.
With the follow through.
Exactly.
And, Jonathan had quite a high follow through from what I can remember.
Yes.
A lot of the time he'd hit it, it'd be quite high. And it would help that to carry him back to the T zone or whatever. So I think all great players. I mean, David Palmer's another example. I mean, he used to carry his weight all the time. Very anti-Australian, considering he was an Australian. But he wasn't really coached by the Institute. He was a bit of a lone wolf. So he developed a completely different style than the Aussie style. But he transferred weight unbelievably well.
Interesting. And when players move way into the front of the court, that's, in my mind, that's probably the most challenging area to transfer the weight in and actually come out of it.
And I think the bottom line is always try and keep your back foot as close to the tee that is possible.
Mm-hmm.
So what you find today is a lot of players, they hit the ball, but it's not in relation to the tee.
Mm.
To me, any squash ball you hit has to be in relation to the tee, if that makes sense. So your back foot is always, it's like you've got a piece of string on your back leg, sort of pulling you back towards that tee area.
Yes.
You know, so they're not leaving the tee by miles. So they've got so much work to do to get back.
But without leaving the back leg in too much.
Too much.
I was about to say, this
What
is a source of contention these days.
Without leaving the back leg in too much. We have to give our opponent a line to the ball.
Oh yeah, I know what you're going to say in there. Yeah, but I wasn't talking about that. But
no, but I just mean in general, it would be quite, because our last podcast was on movement styles and different movement styles on. Obviously I talked a lot about your coaching style. We touched upon, say, like the French, the Aussie, different styles of movement over the years, and how maybe there are benefits and negatives to a few of them. And the difference is because I almost said that I got called out on my movement quite a lot. Yeah. You all know better than anyone. Oh, she's taking too much space. She's getting in the way.
Yeah.
And obviously the rules have changed a little bit now, where as a player, your first thought has to be, have I given my opponent a line to the ball? But there isn't anything particularly unnatural, I don't think, about holding your back leg close to the tee, as long as the back leg is there as you strike, and then you're coming back.
Then you're coming back,
The issues I think that we see with a lot of people taking too much space around the middle at the moment are the back leg is there, and then the back leg is getting either extended further back, or it's being aware that the opponent is going to have to come through that line of your back leg, and you haven't given them the chance to. You know what I mean?
Well, I think you've got two. You've got one, the leg can go back too far and block someone out, or the other thing, like maybe James, without being critical of James, when he used to play the backhand volley well, but he would do the opposite. His leg would come through, so he couldn't get out. Yeah. So what would happen? People would just be in his back, and then you get penalised, a stroke or a let or something. So I think it's your back. You don't want to be doing that, what you've described with your back leg, or you don't want to be falling through because you can't get off the ball either. So that's how I see it.
Yeah, no, I think it was a really good explanation of transfer and carrying of weight. And the one thing I think as well, that when people listening, they can think about that transfer of weight. And Ahad and I have done an online coaching session together as well, where I tried to teach him. We didn't actually talk too much about this, but it was kind of in the mix.
Yeah.
When you really carry weight, transfer weight into the ball, you always used to say you get a nice little pop off.
A bit of a PowerPoint. It's called like a PowerPoint when you come back.
So you don't have to use your quads, do you, so much to get you off?
So when you get that pop off, like your PowerPoint, you might transfer your weight, but when you pop off, you don't block because the pop's so quick that the guy or the lady's got access to the ball.
And this pop, how much, I know, Laura, you just mentioned you don't necessarily have to use your quads as much. How much of that pop, because I think when people are listening, there's going to be a little bit of confusion potentially.
Yeah, there will be,
which says, how am I not using a ton of strength to get out of that lunge?
It's a bit like plyometrics in a way.
Yes.
Is a good way to describe it. So basically, the PowerPoint that I've just described there is only lasting for maybe, it's like in a piece of elastic, for like a millisecond. So you've gone in, you played your shot, and then as you hit the ball, you get this little pump off the ball, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So you don't have to quad so much. It's like a spring. It's like a spring, maybe that type of thing.
Yes.
Like plyometric movement. But, but then you'll get, like some coaches, like Rodney Martin's very much into two-footed stances, getting to the ball very Australian style. So he would be probably totally anti what I'm talking about, So it's Like
in your opinion, without getting too, I don't know, kind of controversial or too detailed, is there anything from that style, the Rodney Martin style, or any other style that you can see the benefits of? Like, what would be, so I know there'll be a few things where you'll go, well, with that style, you can't do this, this, and this. And he may argue, well, with your style, you can't do this.
Don't do this, and this.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that there might be one or two things that are actually really great about that movement, but kind of on the whole, it's not something that you believe in and benefits you to play squash the way that it is. But is there anything that they do particularly well because of that movement?
I think the one thing it might do, it destabilizes you a bit more on the ball than maybe sometimes if you're talking about a transfer of weight. So when you get your two-footed stance, it really stabilizes you on the ball. So if you remember all the Aussie players when they were the best in the world, they were fantastic hitters of a squash ball. Yep. They couldn't play the drop very well, but they were brilliant hitters of a squash ball. So I think that's probably a little bit of the advantage of having your 2 feet together, I would say.
Yeah. Because one of the things we talked about in the movement podcast I had was about almost as an amateur, because we are obviously trying to teach amateurs as well, and you're not going to get people just transforming their movement. One of the things we said was, if you firstly figure out what style of movement you are, and then try and kind of like make it better for the style that you've chosen. So if you do move with a bit more two-footed and you are a little bit closer in with your body, say the Aussie style, then understand that, train for it, look at the videos and see where you might be able to just add a little bit of, improvement.
Well, I think that's it. There's a young lady who plays, who's doing very, very well in the top 10, and I've watched her play a little bit recently, only for 20 minutes. And I think some of what maybe my style might be actually would help her to make that next move to the higher echelons of the game.
But I know what you're saying, and it's that's the thing, isn't it? What we go back to, it's like those little tiny improvements when you've already got a great player. I mean, you're talking about someone who's already top 10 and clearly very, very good at playing squash
and
already.
Little improvements. It's a bit like the grip story with us, which everyone's heard. At the time you thought it was moving your grip by 1 centimeter. What a load of, and it really bugged you and it upset you and different things. But within, I think it was, I can't remember now, 3 or 4 months, to me, that was the one thing that took you to world number 1. I mean, one of the most important things was that grip change.
And DP, for the people who haven't heard the grip story, tell us how poor Laura's old grip was and how the 1 centimeter improved.
I always remember she came along. I think she was in a bad mood actually because she had to travel a long way and it was quite early. So the pie face was particularly pie face that day. And
is that true?
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
And you thought, right, you're getting it today.
No, and then we were on court, and Laura was feeling quite pleased for herself. She was like, I think you might have been like 3 in the world or something like that. And she said, well, DP, what else have we got to work on? And I think Laura thought, well, I'm pretty up there now. I don't need to work on anything else. And I thought, should I go for it? I thought, yeah, go for it. I said, your grip's crap. And she looked at me as though, what the hell do you mean? My grip. So I went through the process of what I was talking about. The grip was crap and what you could get out of, the change in the grip by taking the ball earlier and stuff like that. And I know Laura went home that day in the car because she told me she was crying. I think Danny might have told me actually. She was crying and getting really upset. But she did. But to be fair to Laura, she did take it on board and change the grip by 1 centimeter, Laura. And I remember it was only a few months later you won the Worlds and the British Open, from what I can remember.
Yeah. I think,
and that was a little about a grip change for someone who's already was very good. But you had to bring about down a peg or two. What you see with these athletes, they think they're really good, really fit, train all day. I'm this good athlete. And what I've learned over the years is what you do, you bring them down. You always bring them back down to get to reality, so they don't get above themselves.
Right.
Well, I think as well, just with my take on the grip, firstly, the reason that I think, and I was upset on the way home, and I think this is a fair point to make to amateurs listening as well, because at 3 in the world, the last thing you expect your coach to say to you is your grip's crap.
Yeah.
It's like, and to be fair, I think I'm right in saying it should have been the first thing you looked at.
No, but that's, if you think about it, when you coach kids, for instance, you say the first thing that ever happens when you have a squash lesson, what does the coach tell you? He'll tell you, well, you've got to have, this is how you hold the racket, and you've got to have an open racket face. Maybe they're the two things that they tell you. But it's amazing how much isn't paid attention towards those two simple things.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that's the thing. So driving home, it was like a bit upsetting because it felt like, you're right, you brought me down a peg or two, which you were very good at. And you were, it was a bit of a big change for me to go from like, I've got to change my grip. And obviously for people listening, when you open the forehand grip slightly, the backhand grip closes.
Yeah.
So it was actually a lot of work. What that gave me on the forehand, brilliant, one thing, but is it going to take away from my backhand?
From the backhand, yeah.
And then there was an adjustment, and then the forearm rotation had to come in a little bit more, and then it wasn't just something, even though, I mean, you're saying it was a centimetre, I'd argue it was half a centimetre.
It probably was.
Yeah, like it was minute, really. And I kept thinking, I don't even know if I'm then when you're trying to learn something, you then get stuck between, am I doing my old one or am I doing my new one? Because as the new one gets more comfortable, you're thinking, well, it's comfortable now, so have I gone back to my bad one, or am I doing and I just it like absolutely messes with your head, doesn't it?
But no, you're right, and you're probably right. I was saying, why wasn't it dealt with at the beginning? No, but it's like with everyone, you always, you've got to wait for the right moment.
Yeah, and it wasn't like I had the wrong grip anyway. It wasn't like your grip had a horrendous. It was just
like that.
Yeah.
So that was that little story.
Yeah.
But fortunately, I had a buffer in my good friend Danny.
Yeah. he could soften the blow. He could deal with the aftermath.
he deserves a medal, Danny.
Well, it's interesting when we were speaking to Ranima Lulili the other day, she spoke about developing squash almost like a picture. And she said, you paint certain areas of it, and then you keep building, and you come back and you realize, okay, I have a pretty good picture, but whoa, I've missed a bit of detail over here. Yeah. And then you sort of keep going back and forth and looking at the detail.
Yeah.
And that sounds like the grip, that minute grip change was that final little layer of detail in that one corner of Laura's picture.
Yeah. And also, just thinking quickly, I always remember going back to Rodney Martin. I used to sit with him at the Tournament Champions, and PJ was playing. Mm-hmm. And I was saying, Rodney, and I coached Paul for most of his career. I was thinking, what do you see on his backhand? There's something going on that's not working. Maybe you could give me a bit of advice? And he just literally looked at me, because you know what Rodney's like. So, well, he's got to get his elbow down to the floor. So he was a bit like Darth Vader, PJ. And all Rodney said, just get his elbow down to the floor. And I remember I sat there and I thought, how simple was that? How could I have not seen that little? But sometimes you can't see through the wood for the trees.
That's right.
So other people can help you out. So
I love that.
Yeah,
I love that.
I had just another question in terms of, I've got loads of questions. We could go on for ages, but in terms of a coach, and you touched upon it a little bit just there with what you said, I always felt like I could have asked nothing more of you when we were in the sessions. Obviously, I mean, you were always there before me, and I was there early. You'd always give it your all, really good lessons, kind of total focus. We'd normally go for lunch after. But you weren't a pushy coach. Like you never, kind of once we'd left from the lesson, you would normally leave me to my own devices. But the other really good thing about you is whenever anybody calls you, you generally pick up the phone, unless, even if you're on court.
Yeah.
Hold
That's
on, I'll
right,
just check who that is.
Yeah.
So you always
my
pick up the
wife.
phone,
It's my
which is
wife.
brilliant.
Pick the phone up.
Yeah, you always pick up the phone, but you're always there in the lessons. But then you were never particularly pushy away from the court. You kind of always left me alone and let me ring you. Why was that deliberate, or is that just a personality thing?
Good question. I think I maybe it's a personality thing. I didn't really want to. It was like if you ever wanted something, or Jenny or Nick Matthew or whoever, you'd ring me up and ask me. I didn't want to be this coach that looked like, oh, I coach, Laura Massaro, or I coach Jenny Duncalf, or I coach. It was very much taking a back seat and trying to support you as best I could, and for you to make most of the moves.
Yeah.
So that's it was like, when you think about it, in all the career that we had with each other, 98% of the time you always came to Harrogate. The athlete always traveled all the time, came to the to the coach. It shouldn't be the other way around.
No.
And it's trying to keep a respect going.
Yeah, and I think in turn as well, for I don't know how other players felt, but I always felt less pressure because of that from you. And I think I've taken a lot of that into my own coaching and my own learning, because we're obviously doing this for amateur players and juniors, but hopefully there might be a few coaches listening too, where you go, the more that I personally felt like people talk about me, post on social media, like you're almost kind of making their reputation as a coach. And I guess the lucky thing is for me is that I achieved everything that I kind of could in my career. And a lot of that was down to your coaching and what I achieved. And I don't feel like I actually thanked you enough for that while I was actually playing. So now I've got an opportunity to. But I know that you know it because I've said it to you. But
no, I know that, Laura.
The one thing it always felt like was you cared, but how Laura performed in a squash match wasn't going to affect your life.
I cared more when you lost than when you won. I mean, I did care that you'd won, obviously, because that's the idea of the game. But if you were going through a bad patch, which you did a few times, I think that was probably when I was probably at my best in our relationship, because I wasn't like, I never telling or not telling anybody off or shouting at anybody. You have this relationship, and when people are down, you want to rise them from the ashes, not push them further down.
Yeah. Do you want to tell a story about how nasty you were to me when I won the Windy City Open, or should we keep that?
No, we'll keep that one too. I can't remember that one now.
I want to hear this, Laura. Tell
Laura,
us
you go for it. You probably.
I just won the Windy City Open. I'd beaten Raneem in the final. I was on cloud nine. It was a big title. I'd never won it before. DP was there with me, myself and Nick, and we went to Michael Jordan's Steakhouse, if you remember, after with Nick and Greg and Nick's parents. We had. I didn't eat red meat at the time, so I had salmon in a steak restaurant, and then the dessert menu came round, and I just get this voice from the other end of the table that goes, "You don't need to be looking at the dessert menu with those hips." I've just won the Windy City Open. I'm just thinking a slice of cake. You could be nasty after a win. But you're absolutely right. After a loss, there was no one better at just, another story was a loss I remember at the US Open, can't remember who it was against, and we went for a coffee and you went, you can't get so down after these losses. And that was the mentality that you really started to get into me. Don't get too high with the wins. Don't get too low with the losses. And you started moving a few salt and pepper shakers about and a few sugar sachets. And before we knew it, we had the shape of a squash court on the coffee shop table. And you were like, you just need to get this movement across the tee line. And it was just, those were the moments that obviously two very different memories. But I always remember you being really, really good when when as a player you really, really need a little pickup and a little arm around you, and that's also a big thing as a coach. Like I'm the same. Like maybe that's the knowing of that as a player. The first thing I want to do after a player has lost is just go and put them an arm around them.
Yeah, you don't want to be shouting at them or
no,
or anything like that.
Yeah.
But I suppose, I don't know, for me, I mean, I'm obviously a lot older now, but I was never taught how to coach. I only ever did what I just thought I'd do because I had to make a living when I was younger, and never been to a coaching course in my life.
Wow.
Ever. Never been to anything like that. It all just came from within, like your personality or something like that. And I think the big thing is the personality of a coach is really important. So you get someone like me who's a bit like Laura just explained. I always use Rodney Martin. Rodney Martin, for instance, is a hard taskmaster. He doesn't take any bull.
Yep.
And at the end of the day, what he does works. It might be a very different style than me, but it works. My style, especially years ago, it always tended to work. And I think it's finding out what your style is with what works. Robert Owen is a very divisive individual. He's a bit like Marmite, we say in England. You either love him or you hate him, one or the other. But what he does do, he makes a difference.
Right.
He's made a difference to Jonah Bryant, who's coming up. He's made a difference to Paul Cole. All these different people. So something about him as a person is working.
And do you think certain personalities, like player styles and coach styles, are certain people almost attracted towards certain personalities of coaches? Do you think there's ever a clash with someone like Laura?
So someone like a fitness, like what you might call like maybe someone like Joel Makin, or someone who's obviously very physically strong and extremely fit. My style probably wouldn't suit him in any shape or form, because I've never been a fitness freak. I've always known you've got to be fit to play squash. I was a player once myself, but I was never into, like, for instance, Laura got herself extremely fit, but it was done by maybe some other people rather than myself. Same with Nick Matthew, similar type of thing. So I was always laid back, easy come, easy go. Yeah, show you how to move, show you how to hit the ball. But I was never big into that fitness, Right. I'd let other people who knew more than I did to take that area.
And one could argue that maybe someone like you mentioned, Joel Makin, he might actually benefit more from your style of coaching on movement and so on because he has the other component of it. Maybe some of these other pieces could benefit his game more.
Fit together. And I think for any top player, so, Joel's a very nice guy as far as I know. And, he's got to number 6 in the world, I think he is now, or something like that. If you have ambition to be number 1, you've got to do something a little bit differently than what you've been doing. And that is pretty harsh when you're 6 in the world. But that's what that little bit of difference, whatever it might be, might leapfrog you to that area.
Yes.
So don't keep on doing the same old thing. Yeah, that's right, Laura.
The difference between 2 and 1, the hardest step to make in some ways, and it took a big change from us. But probably the last question from me. I remember us sat, like I said, over in Harrogate. We always used to go for lunch. That was the best bit of the day, really. But we'd have some great chats, wouldn't we, at lunch afterwards. And I remember one chat we had. You can elaborate in a minute, but I asked you if there was some unnegotiables to make it to the very, very top of the game. So if you're a young pro listening, or if maybe you're a coach, like looking to know whether your player has it, I think I've got them written down on my phone, actually. I don't know if it was 3 or I don't know if it was a 5. And there was definitely 3 things that you had up there as something that every single player that you've ever seen, whether you've coached them or not, has had, but particularly probably the ones you have coached. What have they had that's made them be the difference between, say, like top 10
I think
or
every
top
world
5?
number 1, I'm probably going. I think it has to be eccentric. So a bit of a head case in many ways. Every world in the world. Nick Matthew, mad as a hatter. Peter Nicol, mad as a hatter. Laura Massaro, mad as a hatter. So you have to have that different thing in your personality. I don't know what the other ones have said. I think you've got to have a very open mind and prepared to be able to change coaches if it fits, or you've got to open your brain and actually listen. Like Peter Nicol always said, he'd sit at the side of a court and he would ask a member of the public, "What do you think of my game?"
Wow.
And he said most of the time they would just say what he always heard, and then every now and then he'd meet somebody who'd give him a gem. and he'd go away and he'd actually use it. So a completely open mind, not just closed. So I think that's very important. I don't know what else, Laura. What else did I say?
I'm just seeing if I can find it actually on my notes here. But the one thing that stuck out that I thought you'd said was the top was the hating to lose.
Oh yeah, that and having this. You find young kids today, half an hour after they've lost, they're going off playing cards with their mates or something like that. You've got to hate losing, and it's got to bug you. So when you're in a game, if you're 7-5 down, you're like thinking, right, there's no way this is going to happen. So, like Laura was pretty good at this, and Nick Matthew, which was quite interesting. When they were 4-7 down, they actually got better.
Right.
Get worse. When they were 7-4 up, they got worse. They didn't get better. So I
found it on my phone. Let's see if you still agree then. This is, how bad's that? 2016, you said this.
Right.
Well,
what did I say?
Hate to lose.
Yes.
Honesty and respect for yourself and others. Work ethic.
Yeah.
Inner determination. Natural talent. And humility.
I think that's very good. I think I would say that.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Right. Well, there we go then.
And now you add the Mad Hatter to it.
So now we go for the Mad Hatter.
What would you have said? Humility, although you've said Nick and I are a bit crazy. Pete, you cannot put me in this. Me and Cassie are not on the same level as Nick Matthew and Peter Nichol when it comes to madness.
No, you're not. No, Laura, you're not. Seriously, you're not.
But humility
is a big thing. It doesn't matter what you've got to share what you've done in your career, or with other people who have maybe helped you to get there, and just have humility about your wins.
Yeah.
I can't think of another word. Humility just sums it up for me.
Well,
always
it's
be humble, or not get too big-headed, or I don't know what all the words that people use. You've got to be humble.
Well, I think it was very interesting. I remember reading a book. It's called Legacy by a gentleman named James Kerr, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
And it's about the New Zealand All Blacks.
Right.
And the book is about leadership lessons that he took from the All Blacks. And one of the things that he observed was that every time after games, the captains and the key members of the team actually sweep the sheds. So that's their practice, sweeping the sheds. So they go in and actually groom the locker rooms and all of that, and they clean up after themselves, because that's their way of remaining humble and grounded.
Remaining humble, not getting above your station in many ways.
Correct.
It's great to be a world champion or something like that, but there's more to life than that. And that comes a lot from my my daughter is disabled. She has cerebral palsy, and she's never walked since she was born. And with a lot of the athletes, I say to them, you won a squash match, great, but can you imagine what it's like? So always be humble. There's people worse off than you, things like that, and it makes you humble. When you have a daughter like that, it really makes you humble.
Right.
So you have to go through some bad in your life or whatever. So keep the lid on the big-headed stuff.
Definitely.
I love that.
Well,
DP, this was fantastic. Maybe I'll put you on the spot, and you can crush Laura one more time.
I'm trying to think of any of the little story. I've got a whole bunch, but I can't remember any at the moment. Let me have a think. I've got to have one more story on Laura. I can't think of one. I can't believe it.
maybe she's not as mad as you.
No, maybe she's not as mad. No, she's Laura's always been a lovely girl. She used to get a bit of bad press because she was so competitive and got stuck in. But underneath that armor, whatever, she was always a very kind person. Even when she was young, always very kind and humble in many ways.
Well, even since Laura and I started speaking more in the last few months, I remember seeing this Ice Queen personality and persona.
You've got to get to know Laura.
Exactly.
And it's like Jenny, my stepdaughter, who's a good player. She hates publicity, so she's always been a bit behind the scenes with all that. She was number 2 in the world, but she hates you talking about it, or she just likes to be Jenny. And she was very much like that, which I always found very endearing with Jenny. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So
I love that. And actually,
so we haven't got the Asal stuff then.
Yeah, I mean, let's do it. Let's talk for 5 minutes about Asal. I'd love to. I know people would love to hear it.
Well, I watched that video.
Yeah.
I watched it when it first came out. Is it an American video or where they put the lines there? It's about 11 minutes long.
Yeah. It was some anonymous person that created that video.
Yeah, so they created that video, and I watched it, and I thought, it didn't look as bad as they were making out. I mean, there were a couple of movements that were a bit dodgy and a bit bad. And I thought, well, they've really given this guy a hard time.
Yeah.
And it's brutal, isn't it, to be spoke to about like that. And I thought, well, it didn't look that bad. So that's the first thing. I know there's a few things in there. I think it's been very hard for him because I think it's in his DNA. I think he's been brought up to block by the Egyptians, or it could be his father, or I don't know. He's been brought up that way to play squash. Right. What he's trying to do is get better. And I think he has got better.
Yeah.
I think they need to maybe stamp down on him a little bit for certain movements, etc. But I think he's trying to do a lot better than he did when he was younger. And I think it's very hard when you're brought up with that DNA from a young boy for a leopard to change its spots. So if it gets to 7-all or 9-all when it's a really big point, if you get the opportunity to maybe, just it's very hard not to, because it's in his personality and DNA. But I think I think a while ago, I think he was really, really bad. Yeah. And all his celebrations and all that type of stuff. But I think he's been making an effort to clean himself up. And I think the other thing that I think because squash isn't as tight today as it was in yesteryear, sometimes the ball is put in areas where a player deserves not to be able to, get through or whatever. So I think that the looseness of the game contributes to it, if that makes sense.
I think we touched upon that, didn't we? I had in the it was the El Guna final we did a wrap up on, and I think we've tried to stay fairly level headed with any of the Asal stuff, because at the end of the day, I remember what I was like at 23, 24, and I've
been around a lot of years. Yeah. I've seen far worse that in my career.
He's so young. He's got such a long way to go. But we talked about I talked about how little decisions there were in the first 2.5 games of that El Guna final when Ali was playing on a sixpence. There was no decisions because there was no opportunity and no messiness around the middle. And then when the ball got looser and the ball came less height, less width, less tightness, as you say, and all of a sudden it came into play big time. So I don't know, you're absolutely right. We also touched upon, and you'll know, even with the way that I was brought up, how hard it is to get rid of certain elements of your upbringing in terms of that fear of failure and win at all costs mentality that I spoke about in the last podcast, if anyone's not listened to it. And you're absolutely right. Those things are ingrained in you to your core, aren't you? It's how you got your praise when you were young and all of that stuff. So
it's and I think obviously James has spent quite a lot of time with him over, and and he has cleaned him up a lot.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day as well, squash is it's a physical game on a court. Like you're like being a boxer without punching each other. So it's difficult. Someone like Nick but Nick used to talk a lot to the referee sometimes. It's like, Nick, be quiet. For instance, Nick Matthew years ago, he always used to chip at the red, and it was like, keep quiet. But he couldn't do it because it was in his DNA. And I always remember Malcolm Willstrop saying to me once, why do you let Nick Matthew, chip at the referee all the time? I said, Malcolm, if I tried to stop Nick Matthew, do you think I don't try to chipping at the referee? He wouldn't be the player he is.
Right.
You're taking something away from him that's in his personality. And if you try to suppress that naturalness in someone's personality, you're treading on a bit of dodgy ground, I think.
Yeah.
So you've got to try and control them, but you can't control them too much.
Yeah, because sometimes some of these things can also lead to just mental lapses, distraction, and it's out of your control at some point, right?
Look at Jonathan.
Yeah.
You know, Jonathan, I mean, in his career, I mean, flipping heck, but he was funny.
Yeah.
If you wanted to watch, why were Jonathan Power and Peter Nicol the talk of the town for so many years? Because you had one guy who was as mad as a hatter, and you had another one who you thought was like Mr. Sporting, you know, royalty. So those two, it's about like Borg and McEnroe, those two coming together, people wanted to watch it.
Right.
You know.
Yeah.
But that's life. That's a game of squash.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your take on Asal, because I also believe that he's improved quite a bit with his movement, and I think the quality of the game, to your point, is a lot. I mean, it's not just Asal. If you look at any of the top players, they take their space when someone hits a poor shot. Yeah. Because you're putting.
I mean, years ago, I mean, the Pakistani nation, when I was young, I mean, God blimey, they take their space.
Yeah.
I mean, they'd knock your head off. I remember me as a Mangul once, when he was only 15, I played in the British Amateur, which doesn't exist anymore. He said, "Oh, you're playing this young Pakistani boy." I think I was about 21 or something. So I'm playing this little kid. And he was obviously a very good player, especially later on. Well, he drilled me with the ball 3 times.
Oh, wow.
Up the back of the leg and what have you. And I remember thinking, flipping heck. So it was a lot worse to go these days.
Wow.
Oh, but that's,
And they're trying to play Barada in Egypt as well.
Well, Peter Nicol playing Barada, and, so everyone shouldn't be holier than thou. Sport is a competitive environment, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. And it brings out the best and the worst in people, and it always has.
Yeah, the one thing I also about that, just really quickly on that video, people are always calling out little things that they see, right? Like Asal's back leg coming up or something like that. In my mind, a lot of times people don't understand, like, you sometimes counterbalance when you're making certain shots. Like, you're talking about spreading like an eagle, right? Like when you're going for the volley, if you're leaning forward, then some part of your body has to go out the other way to sort of balance you. So, if you're trying to hide the ball with your body, you're having just this extra sort of snap as you're sort of hitting and recoiling. These things happen, but I think when you take any single thing as a frame, it can look like anything.
It looks a lot worse. And I think, and to be honest, I think the referees need to be far more stricter earlier on. They need to say, if you make that movement once more in the first rally or something, it'll be a conduct strokes against you. As simple as that. Not this and ahhing and being decisions being good for one, not from the other. I think referees have got a lot to answer for.
Yes.
I know players shouldn't do things, but referees have really got to step up to the mark here, I think.
Right. Yeah. I love it. Well, DP, that was fantastic. I know. I think you're due for an appointment. I think Laura's probably on her way out shortly as well. So this is great. We're going to have to continue this conversation at some point.
Well, there's always another point. There's always later on.
There we go.
Another day. Yeah.
Well,
we'll get you on at another crucial time and get you to pick the bones of it.
Of it, yeah. All right, Laura. Nice to see you.
Thanks for listening to Between the Lines, where world-class insight fuels the squash journey that never ends. If today's episode helped you grow, please share it with someone in your squash circle and join our community online. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and stay in the rally.